All right, we'll say good morning. Let's begin. So a beautiful daf ahead of us. Today's daf is daf Nun 50. We are picking up on Memtes Amud Beis 49b, and we're picking up with Ha'itmar Allah. 3 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, we're in the middle of a fascinating, a riveting sugya, discussing the idea that a husband cannot create a chazaka in the property of his wife. So the logic being, again, remember the Mishnah a few blot ago espoused a very simple idea, which is the only time you could establish chazaka is when you have no other legitimate reason to be on the piece of property. But because a husband is granted peros in his wife's property, therefore by definition, he has a legitimate reason for his presence. Therefore, again, his presence and his wife's lack of objection to that presence does not create a situation for chazaka. So the Gemara says, and in addition to that, even should a woman go ahead and sign away her rights to a particular piece of karka, to a particular piece of property, she could always claim that the sale is voidable. Why? Because nachas ruach hasisi lebaili. I didn't really want to go ahead and sell this property, but I wanted to preserve my shalom bayis. I knew it was important to my husband, and as such, I agreed to the sale. I agreed to the transfer. So then the Gemara says, "Ha'itmar Allah." But 1 second, regarding that concept that a woman could void a sale based on the fact that she's saying nachas ruach hasisi lebaili, we said the following: Amar Rabba Barafuna lo nitzrucha ella ba'osen gimel sados. So Rabbi Barafuna comes along and says, no. When could a woman say? So take a look at Rashbam. Rashbam, it's about 6 lines up, 7 lines up from the bottom. Ha'itmar Allah ta'hi dechazer v'lakach min ha'isha. Amar Rabbi Barafuna lo nitzrucha lemisnim mekcho batal. Remember again, the Gemara even went so far, just a bit of chazar from yesterday again, the Gemara even went so far to say the following, that even if I go ahead and I purchase a parcel of land from a man, I will say, now everyone knows if you purchase a parcel of land from a married man, so that sale is not totally complete. Why not? Because lemaisa, again, the woman has a shibud, the woman has a lien against all property that is owned by her husband. So I figure, you know what, I have a great way to undermine that lien. I'll go back and I'll purchase her interest as well. In other words, I'll buy from the husband and I'll purchase the wife's interest, the lien interest in that property as well. So the Gemara said, such a sale like that is bottle as well. To which Rabbi Rafuna comes along and says, 1 second, that's only true in 3 cases. Gimel Sados, 3 cases, 3 different fields, where even if you subsequently buy her interest, the sale itself is still void. What are those 3 cases? Achos, shekasav la biksuvasa. So I'll say one refers to a piece of land that the husband specifically wrote her in the ksuva. In other words, let's say in the ksuva, a husband goes ahead and writes, I owe you 200 zuz in the event of death or divorce, and that 200 zuz is collectible from this particular field. It's collectible from this particular parcel of land. So we'll say that's the type of land that's been identified, where we would say that even if a woman subsequently sells off her interest, that sale is not really a valid sale, because since that property is identified, therefore by definition, she does not give up her lien against it. Next, top of nun, va'achas sheyiched la b'ksuvasa. So the second case would be a piece of property that ultimately, again, she was miyached in the ksuva. Now, what does that refer to? Take a look at the Rashbam again. Top Rashbam, nun amud aleph. Lo kasav b'soch hashtar, ela la'achar nisuin yiched la echad misadosav, va'asa apotiki ligbos mimenu ksuvasa. Umiu kol sadosav mishubadim la b'soch shar ksuva, ela al zebo tachas yoser, hoil v'yachtu la b'fnei edim. So we'll say, second case will be a case ultimately again when the field is not written in the ksuva, but he was miyachid the field. In other words, we'll say this would be a case of after marriage. A man would say to his wife, in the event of death or divorce, you will collect your ksuva from this parcel of land. It's not written in the ksuva, but he was miyachid it. He identified it and he specified it. And I will say, the Rashbam points out over here, this is what we would call an apotiki. So remember, we've discussed this concept before. Apotiki is a contraction for apotehei koi. From here is where you will collect. So again, her das is on this piece of land. And number 3, va'achas shechnisa lo shum mishala. And I will say, ultimately, the third case would be a case of where she brought in property, and this property was evaluated. we have the value of this property. Take a look at the Rashbam. V'achar shech nisla shum mishalah, so the shech nisla mibeis aviha, v'shamu oso, v'kasu shavyav b'shtar aksuba, shekiblu alav habal b'damim. V'hein nichsei tzon barzel. So also this refers nichsei tzon barzel means property that a woman brings into a marriage that is assessed. Its value is assessed at the time of the marriage, and the husband guarantees that value. So whether that land appreciates, depreciates, whatever may happen to it, at the end of the day, a husband agrees to go ahead and pay that amount. So I'll say, so all of these are cases where because these are specified properties, either again, specifically written in the ksuva, either post-marriage identified as the source for ksuva payment, or number 3, pieces of property that belong to her, but whose value is guaranteed by the husband. We'll say these would be cases where what? Well, watch this. Even if the husband sold that property, right? Remember, so that has a lien against it. And I were to purchase that property from the husband. And then I went back to the wife afterwards and said, Mrs. Ruvain, I want to purchase your interest in that property. Such a sale would be void. Why? Because it will say, Chazal assume that a woman is not going to sell her lien or her interest in this property for one simple reason. This property, this is her security. This property, this is her ksuva. This property, this is her future. So even if you go back and you buy the interest from her, make chobato. So, okay, I understand then you tell me these 3 cases, make chobato. So what does it come to exclusive? In other words, which would be the cases where Lamaisa, if you were to buy her interest, then ultimately, again, it would work. If you want to say that it refers to other property, so the Gemara says that can't be. Kol shekin dahavila eva. So we'll say this wouldn't work because again, this would also go ahead and potentially cause animosity in a marriage. In other words, if a husband goes ahead and sells property, and then what happens? So the buyer wants to go to the wife and buy her lien against that property, and she refuses. So both say it's going to cause major shalom bayis problems. Why? The Amar law einayich nasata begerishin ubamisa, because the husband will say to his wife, I see you're planning for death or divorce. The fact that you're not going ahead and willing to sell your lien interest against this property, I guess you have plans for the future. To which the Gemara says, Ela lemeute nichsei malug. Rather, it must go ahead and come to exclude the case of nichsei malug. So also remember again, nichsei malug refers to property over which the wife retains title. She brings that property into the marriage. So the title is hers, but the use of the land, the peiros, belongs to the husband. But 1 second, ha'amra meimar. But yet Rabosai Meimar said, so just take a quick look at the Rashbam. Rashbam is pretty much in the middle of the intermediate wide lines. Elavade lemeute nichsei malug. Aser rava baravuna de bahano amar im lakach min ha'ish the chazar v'lakach min ha'isha mekcho kaim. So we'll say maybe again nichsei malug is the case where ultimately if you go ahead and you buy it from the man and then you subsequently buy it from the woman, meaning you buy her interest in the property, that lemaisa again a sale would be good. Techevon d'shalohin eina yigura mibala v'yichola limchos bebayla shlo yimkar. Because I will say I might have said that since at the end of the day this property, the title belongs to her, therefore she has every right to go ahead and sell it. And there's no concern about going ahead and creating any kind of eva, any kind of animosity, to which the Gemara says back to the Gemara. So ha'amra meimar, but Meimar said, ish v'isha shemachru b'nichsei malug. If a man and woman both go ahead and sell the nichsei malug, lo asu v'lo klum. Yet there was we learned that lemaisa again, if a man and woman both sell their interest in the nichsei malug, lo asu v'lo klum. There will say again, such an act is meaningless. Now, what does it mean? Such an act is meaningless. Take a look at the Rashbam again. The Rashbam said, Ha'amar Meimar, Hachi Yasin Kasaga Daitcha Hashta, the Hachi Kamar Ish Shamachar Va'achra V'ish Lo Asuklum, Tematis Amra Nachas Ruach. So why would it be lo klum in this case? It's lo klum because the husband doesn't have the right to sell nichsei malug. Why doesn't the husband have the right to sell nichsei malug? Why not? Because it's not his. It's not his. And b'pashtos, the reason we're assuming the woman is lo asaklum is because she could claim, nachas ruach asisi l'bayli. I was just trying to make my husband happy. To which the Gemara says, ki itmar da'ameimar heicha dezabin ihu umis asihi umafka. So we'll say, so when does Ameimar's statement hold true? That's when ultimately, again, the husband sells the property, he dies, And then again, the Gemara is teaching me, Asya ihi umafka. She, the wife, has the ability to go and extract that property afterwards from the purchasers. Inami. The other possibility is, Zapna ihi umesa, asa ihu umafik. That Rabbi say, if she sells her nichsei malug, and then what happens? And then dies, that the husband has the right to go ahead and extract that property from the purchasers. Why? B'takanta d'Rabbanan. Rabbi say, and this is all takana d'Rabbanan. What's the takana? Ukud Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. The Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. Rabbi say, listen to this fascinating idea. Bu'usha eskino. In Usha, they established the following halacha. Ha'isha shemachra b'nichsei malug. Rabbi say, listen to this takanas Usha. So in Usha, they're attacking the following idea. That if a woman sold her nichsei malug, a woman sold, Rabbi says, remember again, nichsei malug, once again, property that a woman brings into a marriage, title remains hers, peiros goes to the husband. A woman sells her nichsei malug, umesa, and then she died. So, habal motzi miyad halakuchos. The husband has the right to go ahead and extract that property from purchasers. So both say, so remember, so we'll call her Mrs. Ruvain, sells off her nichsei malug, sells it to Shimon. Mrs. Ruvain dies. Her husband Ruvain has the ability to extract that property from Shimon, which Rabbi say essentially makes. What's the takana? The takana essentially is that a husband becomes like a first position balchov legabe his wife. So even though again, in this, what's fascinating about this takana, what's fascinating about this takana is that lamaisa, a husband never actually had title to nichsei malug. All he had was peiros. Yet the takanas usha makes him almost like a lokeach, makes him like a purchaser, really makes him like a balchov, makes him like a creditor, so that when she dies, he has the ability to extract that property from the person who she sold it to. Aval, sa'isha shemachar b'nichsei malug, umeisa habal, ha'isha shemachar b'nichsei malug, umeisa habal motzi mi'ad al kuchos. Aval, hecha dizabinu tarvayu la'alma. But say, watch this, and here's the operative part of our sugya. But what happens if both of them sold the nichsei malug? What happens if both of them sold it? So both say, take a look at the Rashbam. Good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld. Good to see you. So take a look at the wide lines. The wide lines. In the middle of the widest lines of Ahecha dizabinhu tarvaihu la'alma. Listen to this. Hu machar es haperos. Vehi machar es haguf. Now both say, when we speak about both of them going ahead and selling the nichsei malug, they're each selling different things. So he is selling his right to peiros. She is selling the actual title to the karka. So if they were to both go ahead and sell their rights, back to the Gemara for just a moment, inami, zavna ihi lididei, or she were to go ahead and sell her rights to him, the Rashbam says, lebayla, then in that case, Avosai, Zavina, Zavine. In those cases, her sale would be a valid sale. Take a look at the Rashbam for just one moment. Zabnaihu Zavini, Velo Matzis Amrit, Velo Matzis Amra, Nachas Ruach Hasisi Lebaili. De Bishala, Lo Avda Nachas Ruach, De Lo Kapid Ale Bal. Hehilchach Shapir Kadaika Masnisin, Haraya Yesh, Sheim Yesh Lo Shtar O Edim Shemachra Lo Ishto Nichse Maluk Shalah, Havia Mekach Chayv. So we'll say, I have wonderful news. The Shiloh that we opened up yesterday morning on Purim, now has finally come to a resolution. Remember again, we had a Mishnah that said to us that a husband cannot establish a chazakah in the property of his wife, which means a man goes ahead and uses the property of his wife for 3 years, and she never objects. So then halacha l'maisa, what did we say? No chazakah. Again, what's the logic? The logic being that he has the right to use it, so of course she's not going to object. But what the Gemara inferred from that was what? Was that if there was a raya, if he brought a shtar, and he said, my wife, you sold me this property, that shtar would ultimately solidify and cement his ownership of the property. But remember the kasha we raised? The kasha we raised is, how could that be? How could that be? At the end of the day, she could always claim what? I know you have a shtar that says that I sold you the property, but I didn't. I want to make you happy. right? These are words we hear every day, right? I just want to make you happy, right? I just want you to be happy. So, right? So whatever, meaning, so I'm going to sell you the property because you want to buy the property, fine. But at the end of the day, it was not actually my intention to go ahead and sell you the property. So we'll say, so now we worked through all of the cases and we finally figured out the case where what? There is one situation where a sale of a woman's property, ultimately will be a bona fide sale. What is that case, Rabbosai? That's the case of Nichsei Malug. Because what's the case of Nichsei Malug? The title of the property is hers. It's hers. It's the woman's property. And the husband understands that it's hers. So Rabbosai, because it is hers, therefore what? She has every right to do with it as she wants. And Rabbosai, this manifests itself for our purposes in two amazing and dramatic ways. Therefore, number one, should a wife sell her Nichsei Malug to her husband, what's the halacha? The halacha is the sale is valid. So should a husband produce a shtar that says, my wife sold me her nichsei malug, he is the owner, and she cannot claim nachas rachasisi labayli. I was just trying to make him happy. That sale is valid. What's the ramification number two? That if a wife goes ahead and, if a husband and a wife both consent to the sale of the nichsei malug to a third party, then such a sale is binding. Then I will say, remember again, why do you need both of them to be able to consent to the sale of the nichsei malug? Why? Because also they both have rights. Remember, woman has title, wife has title, but husband has peiros. He can't sell because he doesn't have title. She can't sell by herself because she doesn't have peiros. So we'll say an incredible idea. And by the way, just to point out, this is halacha l'maisa. So should this come up for you today, you know exactly how to handle this situation. So it says the Gemara the following. Let's go right there. The other possibility is, Ameimar Damak Rabbi Lazar. Ameimar holds like Rabbi Lazar. Well, say now watch this. This Sanya, get ready. Hamocheres Avdo Pasakim Moshish Mishenu Shloshim Yom. Well, say this is a really fascinating case. I go ahead, I have an Eved, and I sell my Eved to Ruvain. But I go ahead and I make up with Ruvain, that's what? I'm selling you my Eved, but Eved, I still want the Eved to work for me for 30 days. For 30 days. So I'm selling him, but I want it to work for me for 30 days. Rabbi Meir, so now, there's an interesting halacha. Oh, let's read it. Rabbi Meir Omer, Harishon Yeshna B'din Yom O Yomayim Mipnei Shu Tachtis. Well, so let's talk about this in just a moment. Torah says the following, Ach Im Yom O Yomayim Ya'amod Lo Yukam Ki Kaspo. We'll say, if somebody goes ahead and damages or hurts his Eved Kenani, this is a Gentile servant. If the Eved Kenani dies, so a person is Chayiv Misa for that. A person is liable to a death penalty for that. If, however, the Eved, even as a result of the injuries, survives what the Torah calls Fiyom or Yomayim, a day or two. In other words, if the Eved does not die within a day as a result of his injuries, then ultimately the Adon is pater from Misa. That's what's called the din of Yom or Yomayim. So what happens? I have an Eved. I sell my Eved to Ruvain, but the deal is that the Eved is going to work for me for the next 30 days. So I will say, so the Shaila now is, technically speaking, there's an ownership tension. What's the ownership tension? On one hand, I sold the Eved to Ruvain. On the other hand, the Eved is serving me for the next 30 days. So the Shaila is, who is subject to the laws of Yom or Yomayim? So it says the Gemara. Now let's go back to Meir Omer. Harishon Yeshna B'din Yom or Yomayim Mipnei Shu Tachtav. So we'll say the first owner. The first owner is me, the one who actually sold the Eved to Ruvain, but has the use of the Eved for the first 30 days. Vasheni, therefore, according to Rabbi Meir, the Rishon, the first owner, the first guy we'll call him, has the din of Yom o Yomayim. Hasheni eno b'din Yom o Yomayim. But I will say the second owner, we'll call him Ruvain, does not have the din of Yom o Yomayim. Why? Because ultimately, again, the Eved is not in his domain. Now, how can you say the Eved is not in his domain? After all, again, Ruvain owns the title to the Eved. Kasaver, Kinyan Peiros, Kinyan Haguf Dami. Because I will say what happens, because we see from here that a Kinyan Peiros, ultimately, again, the right of usage is the equivalent, ultimately, again, to actual ownership. So therefore, I will say, because I still have the right to use the Eved, therefore what? I am considered to be the actual owner of the Eved. Because I'm the owner of the Eved, therefore, I am subject to the laws of Yom or Yomayim. On the other hand, Rabbi Huda says, Hasheni Sorry. Just a second. So on the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda says, Hasheni yeshno bedin yoma yomayim, mipnei shu kaspo, harishon eno bedin yoma yomayim, she'eno kaspo. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda holds that the second master, we'll call him Ruvain, he is the one ultimately, again, who has the din of yoma yomayim, because the Evet is his property, his kesef. On the other hand, I, the first owner, will say, the one who sold it but now has the right to use the Evet for the first 30 days, I am not subject to the din of Yom Yomayim. Why? Because the Evet is not my property. Kasavar, kinyan peros, lav ki kinyan haguf dami. Because also Yehuda holds that usage peros does not equal an actual kinyan over the object. So you hear this fascinating machlokes. Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda arguing over here. What does Peros? Is Peros the equivalent of ownership or not? Rabbi Meir says yes, and therefore again, it is the first owner, the one who's getting the Evet for the first 30 days, who ultimately again is subject to the laws of Yom Yomayim. Rabbi Yehuda holds Kina Peros Lavka Kinyan Aguf, and therefore what? It is the second owner, Reuven, who is what we'll call the titular owner. He owns the title. That ultimately again, he is subject to the din of Yom Yomayim. Rabbi Yossi says, we'll say Amud Beis, Shnehem yeshnan bedin yom o yomayim. So listen, this is very interesting. Rabbi Yossi holds, the truth is, they are both subject to the laws of yom o yomayim. Why? Mipnei shu tachtov. Zeh mipnei shu tachtov. V'zeh mipnei shu kaspo. Because Rabbi say, interestingly enough, both have a legal right, ultimately, to the Evet. This one, mipnei shu tachtov. So we'll say this one being the first owner, the one who's using the Evet for the first 30 days, because the Evet is under his rishus. V'zeh mipnei shu kaspo. And we'll say ultimately again the second one we'll call him Reuven, because Reuven is the actual owner. Now we'll say, now what does it mean when you say that both are subject to the laws of Yom Yomayim? Or mesafkele I kinyan peros ki kinyan aguf. And I will say ultimately in Rabbi Yossi's worldview, so there's a machlokes, so there's a suffix I should say. Do we say that kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf? Do we say that usage is the equivalent of title or not? Now both say, now the practical ramification of that is the suffix nefashos lahakel. Let's say obviously if you have a suffix as to whether or not kinyan aperos is ke kinyan aguf, is usage like ownership or not? If you have that suffix, then what? Then at the end of the day, I will say, then effectively, neither is subject to the laws of Yom Yomayim. Because also remember again, just to be clear, the law of Yom Yomayim says what? That if the Evet dies within 24, right? If the Evet dies within less than a day, if the Evet dies immediately, you're subject to death. If the Evet survives a day or more, you are not subject to death. We'll say if you have a suffix, then remember again, as Rashbam points out, Tar Rashbam, Shnehem Yashnon, Upeturin, the suffix nefashos the bailim shuku mishanerag mehem lahakel. But I'll say in general we have a concept of suffix nefashos lahakel. That's whenever it comes to a capital case, obviously, again, we are going to be makil. We are going to be lenient whenever adjudicating any type of capital cases. They both say, so remember what we have over here? So far, just keep track of these shitos. The fundamental machlokes at play over here is, do we say kinyan aperos ke kinyan aguf or not? Is usage the equivalent of ownership? Rabbi Meir says yes, and therefore again, it is the first guy who is using the Evet for 30 days, who is considered to be the master and therefore subject to laws of Yom Yomayim. Rabbi Yehuda says no, and therefore again, it is the second guy who is the titular owner. He has the title to the Evet, who is subject to laws of Yom Yomayim. Rabbi Yossi says, I'm not sure, meaning I'm not sure if kinyan peres ke kinyan aguf dami, and therefore again I don't know if it's the first owner or the second owner who is considered to be the real owner, and therefore again essentially neither is subject to laws of Yom Yomayim because safek nefashos lahakel. And now Rabbi Elazar Omer, get ready, shnehem einon bedin Yom Yomayim. Both say shitas Rabbi Elazar is that neither is subject to the laws of Yom Yomayim. Why? Zeh lefi she'eno tachtov, v'zeh lefi she'eno kaspo. So we'll say, so Elazar says neither is subject to the laws of Yom Yomayim. Why? Because we'll say this one lefi she'eno tachtov, right? This one, meaning this one is a reference to the Ruvain, right? The real Baal, right? This one because the Evet is not currently working for him. V'zeh lefi she'eno kaspo, and me Rabbi say me being we'll call him the first or former owner, who's now has the opportunity to use the Eved for 30 days. I'm not subject to Yomi Yomayim. Why? Because the mice at the end of the day, he's not my kesef. Right? So I'll say he's not really my property. And therefore, again, I will say neither of them are going to be subject to Yomi Yomayim. So I'll say, just by the way, just as an aside, as you can see, we paskin like Rebbe Lazar. So first of all, again, just to take one step back. Well, okay, let's finish this. Rava said, my time is Rebbe Lazar. Why is it? What's Rebbe Lazar's logic? Because the pasuk says, "Lo yukam ki kaspo hu." Because the pasuk says, when speaking about the laws of Yom or Yomayim, says, "Ach im Yom o Yomayim yamod lo yukam ki kaspo hu." We'll say if the Eved survives for a day or two, lo yukam, there is no punishment that is leveled against the owner. Why? Ki kaspo hu. For the Eved is the property of the Adon, to which the Gemara darshans, kaspo hamiyuchad lo. We'll say Rebbe Lazar's worldview ultimately is that the only time you could have a situation of Yom Yomayim is where what? Is where you have an Eved who is the exclusive property of one Adon. But where the Eved to begin with is shared property, then Lamaisa, again, there is no din of Yom Yomayim. So we'll say, so just, again, this is one of these fascinating Shas Machloks, in that it's good to, could be good elevator talk also. You're with someone, want to make a little conversation. By the way, did you just see Machlokes, King and Peres, King and Aguf, 4-way Machlokes? So both say, so just so you understand, this is a Yisodistic Machlokes. So first of all, again, remember, it's manifesting in a very specific situation of Eved, of Yom Yomayim, but the real underlying Machlokes is, do we say King and Peros, Kekinyan Haguf Dami or not? That's really the real shiloh over here. Rabbi Meir says yes, Rabbi Huda says no, Rabbi Yossi says I'm not sure, and again, at least for the din of Yom Yomayim, Rabbi Lazar comes along and says, in order for the din of Yom Yomayim to be in effect, what? It has to be the, we'll call it the singular kesef of one of the owners. If it's somehow, there's some level of joint ownership, then there is no din of Yom or Yomayim. Now, both say, I'll show you something interesting. So the Gemara, the way we got into this, just to understand, the way we got into this is that Ameimar was of the opinion like Rebbe Lazar. I will say, which for our purposes ultimately would mean that it's possible that Ameimar holds that the only time that Lamaisa, the sale of a property of a woman, ultimately again will be valid is in a situation where that property is singularly owned by the woman. In other words, the Gemara is linking the shitos of Ameimar and Rebbe Lazar, which tells us just like Rebbe Lazar holds the din of Yom Yomayim is only in a case where the Eved is owned exclusively by one master. So too the sale of property from a woman to her husband or to someone else will only be valid when that property is singularly owned by that woman. So we'll say, so bottom line, halacha l'maisa, we emerge with two important ideas. Two different pieces of halacha l'maisa. First piece of halacha l'maisa, we'll say, is, number one, a husband does not have the ability to establish chazaka in his wife's property. It's a very important yisod, which Shabbosai means that if a man comes along and says, I am the owner of this property, v'haraya, I've been using it for 3 years, and my wife never objected to my usage, we say to him, of course you have never objected to your usage. Why? Why? She loves you, right? Beautiful. Right? Because at the end of the day, not have to get so mushy, because at the end of the day, you have peros, right? You have the right to use it. So of course you have no chazaka. We'll say, what about if he produces a raya? What if he produces a shtar that says that his wife sold him the property? So is that shtar considered to be a binding raya, conveying to him ownership? To which we say, it depends. It depends on what kind of property. Specifically, again, if it's nichsei malug, then the shtar stands. If it's nichsei malug, then ultimately, again, which is property over which the wife has singular title, and he produces a shtar that says, I own this, produce a shtar that says that she sold him this property, then einachinami, that will establish his ownership over that property. Furthermore, I will say, if a third party produces a shtar that says the third party is the owner of the nichsei malug, that shtar will be valid as long as what? as long as it has the consent of both parties, the husband and the wife. The husband selling his right in the peiros, the wife selling her title. Ultimately, that transaction will stand. So we'll say that is halacha l'maisa by nichsei malog. Second piece of halacha l'maisa is the din of Yomi Yomayim. We pass in like Rebbe Elazar, that's when you have a situation of an eved that has some level of joint ownership. So in this particular case, where one person holds the title, but another person has the peiros for some amount of time, because there is joint ownership, there is no din of Yomi Yomayim. Yomi Yomayim only applies in a case where an eved is owned by one singular adam. Good, weiter. It's incredible stuff. So remember again, going a little bit weiter in this sugya. A husband does not have the ability to have a chazaka in the property of his wife. But Rav said, Eishes ish tzricha limchos. So this is an interesting case over here. So Rav said that an Eishes ish, a married woman, has to object if someone is using her property. Take a look at the Rashban. Right across in the Rashban. Eishes ish, shehechsik achar benichse meluk shala. We'll say if there is a married woman and someone else is using her nichse meluk, she has to go ahead and object. Tzricha limchos, mishum dahu achar yishlo chazaka, imlo michse hefsida. So we'll say, if you have a following situation, a woman who's married has nichse meluk, she has property, the property is hers. And what happens? Someone is using her property, she has an obligation to make a macho. Let me say it differently. If she wants to prevent that person from establishing a chazaka on her property, she has to what? She has to object. Which tells us what? That if she doesn't object, then what? Then that other person could go ahead and create a chazaka in her property. Samar says, the man, who are we talking about? Meaning, who is using her property? Ilema ba'achar. So we'll say, if you want to say that it's an acher now, we'll say, who does acher refer to over here? Someone else, meaning someone other than her husband. V'ha'amarav. Ein machzikin b'nichse eishasish. We'll say a very interesting halacha. You cannot make a chazaka in the property of a married woman. Right? Why? We'll say why is that. Take a look at the Rashbam again. Ein machzikin b'nichse eishasish. Dematzia amra al baili samachti shehu yimcha v'ya'arar. Ulakach shatakti. Ubishabne adam delo bal ka'amarav dein machzikin shkemashra ein machzikin l'sham. So let's listen to this. This is fascinating. Another person cannot establish a chazaka in the property of a married woman, even if the married woman was silent for 3 years. How? Why not? Because I will say, a married woman could always say what? I assumed my husband was going to make a macha. I assumed my husband was going to object to the usage of that property, also, which makes sense. Why? This is not like a din in defending one's wife. This is a very practical din. Any property that she has, b'pashtos what? He has some level of rights in it, right? Whatever those level of rights are, right? Whether it's look, at the end he has rights. So a married woman has every right to say, listen, I assumed my husband was going to object to the use of this person of my property. Therefore, again, I felt no need personally to go ahead and object to this individual's usage. So we'll say, therefore again, so remember, we'll say, what are we operating off of? We're operating off of the statement of Rav. Rav said that a married woman has to make a macha if someone is using her property in order to prevent that person from establishing a chazaka. We are trying to figure out who is Rav's statement referring to. So if you say it's acher, if you say ultimately again it's referring to another person, that can't be, because the married woman is not obligated to make a macha in that case, because she's permitted to say, I relied on my husband to make a macha. Ela lav bebal. Rather it must be what? It must be your husband. It must be that Rav is saying that a woman must make a macha, must object to her husband's usage of the property in order to prevent him from establishing chazaka. To which the Gemara says, but 1 second. Rava said, you're right, the olam babal. Indeed, you are correct. We are talking about the case of Baal, of husband. But take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. We'll say, Elav bebal. Alma yesh chazaka v'kashta masnis. So we'll say, here's the problem. The problem is now what you're telling me is that a man does have the ability to establish chazaka on the property of his wife. What's the problem? Very simple problem that contradicts the Mishnah, because the Mishnah told me that a husband does not have the ability to establish chazak in the property of his wife. Also, what's the case? So again, Rava says, no, you're right, the Olam Babal. We are dealing ultimately again in the case of Babal. I'll say one more Rashbam, the Olam Babal, shehechsik benichse ishto ka'amarav. Indeed, we are saying now that a husband does have the ability to establish a chazaka in his wife's property. I'm just reading the Rashbam, second wide line, not the widest lines, but the intermediate lines. But what about the Mishnah? The Mishnah was so explicitly clear that a husband doesn't have the ability to establish chazaka in his wife's property. Boros Sichin umaros dilaperos hu dishtabale nixemog de ishto v'lo lekilkol akarka lechapiras boros. Suppose I watch this. So back to the Gemara. So I'm reading ahead. Amar Rava. Rava says the Olam Babal. Suppose I follow this train of thought. It's very exciting. So what happens? Rava says, you're right. What are we dealing with over here? When we spoke about the case, Rav's statement that said that's what? That if someone's using a married woman's property, she has to object in order that the person shouldn't cement the chazaka. Who are we talking about? The husband. Husband, what are you talking about? The Mishnah said that a husband can't establish a chazaka in the property of his wife. We'll say, what's the case? Ukigon shechafar ba boros sichin umaaros. We'll say, what's the case? You see, when do we say that a husband can't establish a chazak in the property of his wife? We'll say that is, let's say a husband goes ahead and uses the payros of his wife's field for 3 years. He doesn't establish chazak there. Why not? Why not? Why not? Because he has those rights. That's not indicative of chazaka. That's the usage of his regular rights. Avraham say, watch this. Let's say he decides to dig holes. He's got some time on his hands. He decides to go ahead and dig boros sichin umaros. Rabbi say, that's demonstrative of ownership. Because Rabbi say, the moment that he starts getting payros, that's not demonstrative of ownership. That's demonstrative of his rights of payros. But if he starts digging pits in the field, and the Rashbam just points out over here that it's dafka sada she'ena asuya laboros. It's dafka sada, which again you would not normally dig pits in, and he's digging pits. What does that show? That shows, and she will say, and what's the case? The case is where what? She doesn't say anything. She doesn't object. That's demonstrative of ownership. But one second, it's kasha. V'amrav Nachman amrav Rav ein chazaka l'nizakin. But I will say, one second, we learned this concept before, that you can't establish chazaka through destructive activity. Take a look at the Rashbam again. Ein chazaka l'nizakin, kilamar heicha demazik lechaveiro, ein yachal liton lekucha hi biyadi, sharech zakti ba gimel shanim bechaviris baros sich lemaros, techi agavno lahabi chazaka, dematiton idach, mishon doach zakta k'demechaskin shlo chashizim chos. We learned you cannot establish chazaka through destructive activity. What I will say, now the logic over here is quite interesting. You can't establish chazaka through destructive activity for one simple reason. Because the owner of the land could say that since you are not demonstrating ownership in a proprietary constructive way, like that? Proprietary constructive? Proprietarily constructive. Proprietarily constructive. I like that better. Good. I'm going to get a second opinion. Proprietarily constructive? Good. Fine. Proprietarily constructive way. Therefore, Lemais, again, I've always said that's not called chazaka. In other words, the Rashbam says that because it was not proprietarily constructive, therefore, again, I felt no need to object to that. Therefore, I will say there is no chazaka through destructive action. So even if the husband is digging boros, sichin, uma'aros in the property of the wife, that doesn't establish his chazaka. To which the Gemara says, Eima ein din chazaka l'nizakin. No. I will say, listen to this. The Gemara says, when Rav Nachman said, din chazaka l'nizakin, I will say, what he meant was the following. Ein din chazaka l'nizakin, which means what? This is amazing. See, normally chazaka takes how long? Normally chazaka takes 3 years. There are some acts that are so profound, that are so impactful, that are so powerful, that they establish chazaka immediately. Like what? Like destructive activity. I will say, when you destroy property, ein chazaka gidola mizo. Right? The greatest demonstration of bailus is the ability to do whatever you want with the property, even what? even destroy it should you choose. The Gemara is suggesting maybe what it means is like this, that at the end of the day, when the husband starts going out and digging boros, sichin, ma'oros, in the wife's property, then what? That you don't even need 3 years. That's immediately demonstrative of chazaka. Another possibility is lav itmar Allah. Say, when did we say that in chazaka l'nizakin? That's Rav Mari Amar Bekutra, Rav Zavid Amar Bebeis Hakisei. Say that was with very specific types of hezek. Right? Whether, again, Abosai, it's referring to someone ultimately, again, who keeps a fire burning that produces a lot of smoke, or a Beis HaKisei, an outhouse. So also take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. V'bai sema ha'itmar la Rav Mari Amar Kilomar, v'bai sema li olam cheskas gimel shana ba'inan. It could be that even under normal circumstances, in the chazak of 3 years, afilu heichad dechafer ba boros kida okmina lemilsa derav, v'had dekam Rav Nachman in chazak l'nizakin, lo b'cheskas gimel shana bekarka chaveiro ayri, ela ba'ose hazek lechaveiro, afilu bebayis shal atzmo, kigon, ashan, v'reachra, v'asla ruyesh lo yazik lechavira afilu hechzik kamim rabim, ein chazaka mo elas lo hazik chavira. So the other possibility is, when do we say ein chazaka l'nizakin? That's only in the case of also of ongoing damage, like smoke damage, or like having a beis hakisei, which again produces obviously a negative odor within the property of the individual. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef, just 3 more lines and we'll stop. Rabbi Yosef, Amar li olam ba'acher. In reality, we're talking about, again, someone other than us. We're supposed to say, listen to this. So, maybe what we'll do is like this. So remember, just let's keep our eye on the ball. We're trying to focus on over here. Rav made a statement. And the statement that Rav made is that Eishes ish tzricha limchos. That a married woman has to object when someone is using her property in order to prevent that individual from establishing a chazaka. We are trying to figure out who is it that she has to object to? Who are we talking about? So it can't be ba'acher, it can't be someone else, right? Why? Because we established otherwise that a married woman doesn't have to object to someone else's uses of her property. Why not? Because she assumes ultimately, again, that it's going to be her husband who is able to do that. Rather, the Gemara said that what? It must be the Baal. It must be her husband. But one second, about say, how exactly is a Baal demonstrating a chazaka, ownership of her property? If it's just by going in and getting the peiros, then what? That's not going to be good, because no chazaka by peiros. Why? Because that's his right. So maybe you're going to say it's damages. Maybe what he's doing over here is that he's damaging the property. So I'll say, here's the problem. The problem with that approach is that even though we have a statement of ein chazaka l'nizakin, you can't establish a chazaka through destructive property. There's a machlokes exactly what that means. Does that mean there's no chazaka through destructive property? Or does it mean what? Or does it mean, no, there's no stronger chazaka than destructive activity, because l'mais, again, that's the greatest demonstration of ownership. But even if you say that, what types of nezek does that apply to? Therefore, Abosai, that interpretation of Rav's statement does not work. We're going to stop over here. I'm leaving you a little bit on a cliffhanger, and tomorrow morning, Yemir Hashem, I'm going to pick up with the statement of Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef has a new interpretation as to how to understand the statement of Rav. Shkoyach.